Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program, and our main goal is to talk about and understand why the political system is dysfunctional and polarized, and how we're going to fix this. We have a wide range of topics that we cover, and like to get outside the box every once in a while. This is the time of the year when it's the Ideas Fest in Aspen, and I usually go and try and kidnap some of their speakers. Our guest today is going to be Lee Duckworth, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Angela got my attention for a few reasons, one of which she runs something called a character lab. Now on the show, when we've talked about dysfunction, etc., I've talked about leadership and a leadership vacuum we have in our country and people not wanting to step up and make decisions, make hard decisions, force compromise. We've lost that. But I fell in love with this new word, character. And I think our country has lost some of its character too. Angela's going to help us understand a little more about what character means and how she's going about building this character lab where she's teaching character to young kids. At the same time, I understand that Angela wrote a great new book, which I read, which is called Grit. Now we're going to learn from Angela that grit is a subset of character, but they all come together. And the fascinating part is that they can be learned tools. So you can develop character and you can develop grit. One of the things that Angela studied is the difference between just being really smart and intelligent and being successful and being gritty and successful. And she's finding that grit wins over intelligence. I thought this was fascinating. We're going to do something a little different today. Instead of me introducing Angela, she has a terrific short TED Talk that I think really encapsulates what we're going to be discussing with Angela. And before we start our conversation, we're going to cut to the TED Talk, and Angela's going to tell you herself all about grit.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests, I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future. day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires, and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure, things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters, it's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
So how did you find grit, or did grit find you?
I found grit. I was a teacher before I was a psychologist, and I think any teacher can tell you that some kids do really well, some kids don't do really well. Of course, you're teaching the same thing on the same blackboard. And I originally thought as a teacher it was going to all be about smarts. It's going to be like some kids were great at math, that's what I taught, and other kids, you know, not so gifted. But I was amazed over the course of the year to find that effort, you know, like high quality attention and effort was a huge factor in which kids ended up doing well. And that was quite different from how smart they were. That led me to become a psychologist, and among other things, I've studied grit as one of the things that gets people to work very hard over long periods of time.
If you've written a great book, who's the book for? Who should read this book?
When I first wrote this book, I had in mind teachers and parents, because my life goal is to help kids thrive. That's what I did as a teacher, and I actually repurposed myself as a psychologist so I could, in a sense, go back to kids and with this new understanding of why they did the things they did, help them grow up to be as great as they could be. But actually, I think when I sat down with my editor, he made the point that really a lot of people are interested in grit who aren't teachers or parents. So I actually wrote the book for anybody who is interested in becoming the best person that they can be, and in some cases also raising children to be that way.
And what's the feedback you're getting?
Some people really love it. I think for some people it really resonates. They tell me that, you know, they now have a word and a scientific literature to map onto their their intuitions, and sometimes these people are very successful and would say that their superpower was never their IQ or their talent. I think other people have been critical, and so I've also heard people say that, you know, when you emphasize things like grit, it sounds like you don't care about poverty or racism or, you know, structural barriers to achievement. And so I've gotten both positive and negative feedback.
And we're going to get to this later, but one of the things you're doing in that regard is you started the Character Lab to try and have an educational place to go here to develop character and grit. So you're responding to them, in other words, right?
Well, I will tell you, I mean, whether I'm responding or not, I mean, when I was a teacher, I always taught public school kids. I never taught in a school that had, you know, children of privilege, honestly. And so I don't know whether it's a change or just I would like to tell the world, like, of course I know that poverty exists. I have taught students from tremendous disadvantage, and so I don't think it's a change personally, but yes, I have a nonprofit called Character Lab, and it's just an extension of what I've always felt to be the case, which is that we should love all kids. Absolutely. I love my own 2 kids, but I think we should have a special attention to the kids who have the least. And so Character Lab tries to help all kids thrive, but we pay special attention to the kids who have the least opportunity.
Okay, so let's walk through the book quickly, because I know we don't have a ton of time today. And it starts with why it matters. So why does it matter?
You know, life is hard, and doing things that are really great, whether it's having a show or writing a book, or, I mean, I really can say this about anything. I don't want to trivialize it, like baking a really great blueberry pie, right? If you want to do anything really well, anything worthwhile, it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take a lot of failures, a lot of missed attempts. And so what is the psychology of trying really hard and getting up again when you fall down over and over again so that you can accomplish something of worth? That is actually why grit matters, because nothing that's worthwhile in this world is easy to do.
So I know when I was in school, and a long, long time ago, and you were in school more recently, but you tell a story about you being in school, and you took a really hard class, and they wanted you to drop the class. And then you didn't do well in your next exam, and they still wanted you to drop the class, and you dug deep. And I guess I'm bringing this because I don't think I ever learned that lesson when I was in school.
Interesting.
I became a professional, and when I was a professional and I had clients, I understood that if I didn't perform at an A level for them, I couldn't retain them. And I had to learn what their A level was, not my A level. And I had to get to their A level. So it was like getting a grade. It was like, well, like what you went through. How hard is it for people to figure how much they can push themselves to get to their A level?
It's a great question, and I will tell you that, you know, people are going to have different stories, right? So, you know, how you figured out that lesson sounds like it was different from how I figured it out. I will say this, you know, you never really know, do you? Right? I mean, that's one thing I would love all young people to appreciate. You know, they have told me, you know, my own students when I was teaching, you know, 7th graders or, you know, 16-year-olds, like 19-year-olds now at a university, you know, they'll tell me that they've reached their limit. They'll tell me that, you know, like they can't do better. I tell them, you know, you don't really know. I don't really know, right? But we should start from the idea that, you know, it sometimes feels like you've done your best. It sometimes feels, kids will tell me this about math. It's like, I've gotten to this level of math, but I can't possibly do calculus, right? Because I know that this is, you know, the kind of person I am, these are my genes, whatever, but they don't really know. And I think if you at least start from that if you don't know, maybe you should, you know, try a little harder, try a little differently, try to get a little help from someone who's maybe a better tutor. I think the not knowing kind of sets you free to start experimenting.
So the interesting thing about grit, and you distinguish it from intelligence, is that grit can be learned. It can be developed. I mean, your intelligence, most people probably have a plateau where they can go on intelligence tests or something, but you don't maybe have a grit level. You can learn to get to your grit level.
So I'm going to say 2 things. One is, I do think grit can be learned. I think curiosity can be learned. I think gratitude can be learned. I think every aspect of what Aristotle and Martin Luther King called character can be learned. People can get better. And so we shouldn't, you know, derogate, I think, the self-help industry or, you know, ridicule people who listen to podcasts to improve themselves, because it's true. You can improve yourself and you can get better in grit and in all these other aspects that we would collectively call character. But let me disagree with you on the first thing, which is I think you have an intuition that you can't really change how smart you are, that basically your intelligence is whatever it is, and it's fixed, and it's probably largely biological and, you know, kind of something you were born with. Neuroscience and other kinds of evidence suggests that actually, depending on your environment and your enrichment and how much you end up thinking and how much stimulation you get and how much challenge, you can actually make intelligence go up and down. And so I think the moral of the story of human development is that much more is malleable than we ever thought. And so you can't change your height and you can't change your eye color. But
I can't change my weight.
you can change your weight. You can change your weight. You think you can't.
I need grit.
You do. You need grit, and you know, it's not easy. It's not easy. But when it comes to the mind and willpower, and grit, and so many things that we would consider, you know, character, not your weight, but at least the willpower to do. I think those things are things that you have something that you can do.
Now, one thing I found fascinating is you found ways to, I don't know if it's called testing grit or at least predicting grit. So you can go to a military academy and predict who's going to survive the military academy. You can go to a spelling bee, figure who's going to do well in a spelling bee. You can predict this. Is this something you invented or you collaborated with other people? How did that come together?
I created a grit scale after interviewing paragons of grit and actually also just, they were high achievers, right? So I started off doing these interviews with, you know, people who had won Olympic gold medals or had been, you know, at the top of their fields in as many different fields as I could find. And when I found this through line, this kind of, you know, pattern of people who were so passionate about what they did, and also not just passionate but hardworking, sustaining that kind of consistent passion and work over time, I said, why don't I write down in a questionnaire the kinds of things that I hear in these interviews, and that became the grit scale. So for example, people would tell me, you know, no one outworks me. I am the hardest worker, you know, of every group that I've ever been in. And so that became an item on the scale. I'm a hard worker. And so that became the grit scale that I used for research. For example, at West Point Military Academy, I went on day 2 of West Point's first summer of training, and I gave this scale to cadets. And I asked the question, well, I asked the data, you know, what the answer would be. Will grit predict who stays through this really tough summer? And will it be a better predictor than, for example, their SAT scores? And it turns out that grit was a better predictor of making it through that really hard first summer of training than pretty much anything West Point conventionally measures, including your SAT scores.
So interesting you mentioned SAT scores. I know Harvard and all these schools aren't testing people anymore. Do you think they're going to just start testing grit to see who they want to admit to Harvard and Penn and other schools?
So some schools, not all, some schools have changed their policy on standardized tests like the SAT. Some schools are no longer using them. I do not recommend, you know, swapping out the SAT for the grit scale.
You don't, come on. You
Well,
could
the
become
grit scale,
incredibly wealthy and famous and important and change the world.
If you're trying to get into Harvard, I think the answer of like, what am I a hard worker or not a hard worker is pretty obvious. So I think all self-report scales, including the ones I use for research, where in research, you know, you're not trying to get into Harvard, you're just filling out a confidential questionnaire. I think they're too fakeable for use in, you know, employment or college admissions. But I think they're useful for self-reflection. I mean, I recommend people take the scale and just reflect. I mean, that's a really powerful thing to say, oh yeah, when's the last time I had an interest that I held on to for more than a few years? Like, these are questions that I think can be helpful. For reflection, not for admission to college.
All right, so we definitely want people to read the book, learn about grit, and learn how to bring that into their life. And there's some terrific chapters in this book. Parenting for grit, I thought, you know, as a parent, was very enlightening for me too. I wish we had more time to go through every chapter with you today. But we don't. But I want to move over to the character lab, because somewhere in here you've decided to, I don't know if institutionalize is the right word, and you've moved somewhat to grit to character, because character is more encompassing than grit, right?
Character is exactly that. It's more encompassing than grit. I think of character as not just grit, but also gratitude, generosity, honesty, integrity, curiosity. I mean, as I list these things, by the way, when we think about...
It's like the Eagle Scout scale.
Yes, in fact, actually, if you
Brave,
look at
thrifty, reverent.
right, the code of the Eagle Scouts, or you know, you look at like the code of West Point. You can look at, you know, Benjamin Franklin had a list of 13 virtues that he worked on every day. Think about the 10 Commandments. I mean, every religion
this
has
is the Duckworth code.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that I invented, character, but I do want to say that I'm a big fan of character. And if you look at what's happening in this country today, a lot of unrest, a lot of dissatisfaction on both sides of the aisle. I mean, I would say that, like, listen to that list, right? If our leaders had curiosity and empathy and compassion and grit and self-control, and another, 6, 7, 8 things. I mean, I think we'd all be in a better place. So I think character in some ways is a timeless idea. It goes back to Aristotle, it goes back to Confucius, it goes very, very far back, but it's also timely. I think we need it now more than ever.
So as I mentioned to you, I went to your website, which is a great website, we'll talk about it in a minute, but I stole a 3-minute segment where you talk about the Character Lab, and we're going to cut to that now.
Great.
I absolutely do believe that character has a place in schools. I mean, like, kids wake up and they go to school and they come home. By that time, it's late afternoon. They've had all these interactions during the day with their peers and with grown-ups called teachers. How do I translate that into character? That's the work that I hope to do through the Character Lab.
So we're going to the Character Lab today, and we're going to meet with Angela Duckworth, who's been doing research on how do you develop character in the classroom setting. She really focuses on the whole child. It's not just about academic success. Schools are using Angela's work to help kids reach their fullest potential. Angela, how are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for coming.
Good to see you again.
Yeah. I define character as Aristotle did, which is ways of being, ways of feeling and acting that are both beneficial to the self and also to the greater community. If you take character as that, then that encompasses grit and self-control, but also gratitude and emotional intelligence and generosity and curiosity, creativity, imagination, open-mindedness. These are competencies. These are things that kids can develop.
What's one of the most exciting new ideas you'd like to see in classrooms?
We're just at the beginning, but there are some, promising developments. We all have these to-do lists, right? Every time you think about goals, you can think about them in a hierarchy where you have the sort of specific, concrete to-do list things that you have to get done. Have this interview today, get myself a coffee, return that email. Then you can ask the question like, well, why do I want to send that email? Like, why do I want to have this interview? There's some why that I have that goal. Like, well, I want to have this interview because I actually really care about communicating some of the most important things that are going on for my nonprofit, the Character Lab. It's like, the interview in a way is a means to an end. So I have this sort of higher level goal. But there's another why, and it's usually more abstract, more long-term. Like, I'm trying to figure out how to teach self-control to kids. Okay, why? Because I think character is one of the most important things that a kid could develop. So every time I move up, that goal becomes more abstract, more meaningful, honestly, to me. And when you talk about really gritty people, they have a singular, at least professional goal, right? Many people started actually just by having these low-level ones. And I think this is where kids are. I mean, I don't think many kids know when they are growing up, like, what it's all about yet.
I think for a lot of our kids right now, this is getting into college X.
Interesting, yeah.
And it's something that's external rather than internal.
And
I think it's really concerning.
Yeah, and you know what? Like, having an ultimate concern that is imposed entirely by another person is not a good ultimate concern.
Right.
If we can get kids to realize that college is like up here, but there's yet something.
There's something more.
And
right.
Like, education can, be a big part of this because it is in schools where kids can, find and develop and deepen their interests, learn how to do hard things like practice and embrace challenge. And then one thing that schools can and should do is show kids that they're not just individuals out for themselves, but they're part of society, and everything they do influences other people.
That's why your work is so exciting. If science can empower schools to teach character, we'll ultimately be building stronger citizens and communities for all of us.
So I mentioned I went to your website and stole the video. Let's talk about the website. Because it's very educational, and I think it's a great insight into what you're doing right now. So if I go to your website, what do you want me to find there, and what do you want me to learn when I'm there?
So come to my website, characterlab.org.
Should have asked that part too.
Yeah, right. So
Characterlab.org.
I'm pitching it. I'm
Okay.
selling it, man, and it's easy to sell because it's free. We're a nonprofit. If you are looking for a psychological science to help yourself and kids thrive, that's what it is. So if you're thinking, you know, I don't get anything done. I have all these dreams. I have all these like unfulfilled dreams, frankly, because I keep procrastinating. I never get around to doing things. I never start my diet, my exercise plan, my application to graduate school. I can't get my kids to do things. It's the summer, but they're sitting around on the sofa doing nothing. There is, for example, the science of goal setting and planning in, I think, about as easy to understand a form as possible. So we took all that hard science that comes out of journal articles and research laboratories, and we put it into language I think that anyone could understand. We have goal setting and planning activities, where it's like if you want a sheet to actually write down your goals and make plans based on science, here's really the most efficient way to do that. There are videos. I mean, I think the idea for me is that psychological science really can be helpful, but I don't think most people are going to go and read academic articles that are very long and very technical and read like 150 of them and then go back and say, okay, now I know what to do about my procrastination problem. So you can go there for all kinds of ideas, not just about goal setting and planning, curiosity. There's information, of course, about grit. There's information about how experts practice, and it's a work in progress. So I would say that if you come visit characterlab.org, you should also come back because we're trying to make it better and we're trying to offer more.
And then we have time for maybe one last question here. And now you're taking this into the schools, right? So you're moving a program into the schools. How's that going?
So we are working with schools, but we're not actually going in person and standing up in front of the classroom. We're actually mostly interacting with teachers through our website. So really what you see on the website is mostly how we're interacting with schools. And we are actually, in addition, in July, which is not very far from now, July 12th and 13th, we're having an in-person event in Philadelphia hosted by me and my friends for teachers who are really passionate about learning more about the science of how kids thrive. And if you look on the website and you see that it's sold out, it's not exactly sold out because I saved some spaces. So if you email info@characterlab.org, then I might be able to squeeze you in.
Okay, and if they can't get squeezed in, will that then be on the website and they'll be able to see the videos of that?
Exactly.
Well, I congratulate you on a great adventure.
Thank
I
you.
don't know where you see yourself going next year, and obviously I have a sense that the grit within you has that all mapped out what the goals are.
Just try to get better. That's what gritty people do.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed today's show. As always, we wanted you to have fun, and we wanted you to get educated a little. You can't avoid having fun with Angela because she's a dynamo, and she's got a strong message, and she's an educator. So hopefully you've learned a couple things today. You've learned about grit, and you've learned about character. Two very strong words, but two words I think we need to bring back in order to help break this cycle of dysfunctional polarization, particularly character. I think we've got to find political actors that are willing to step up and make a difference and solve problems, and I think a lot of that has to do with character. So I encourage you to check out the Character Lab that Angela's developed. They've got a great website and a lot of learning tools there, which you can use perhaps in your life. And I encourage you to read her book, Grit. It's a great book. And again, grit can be learned. So if there's parts of your life that could use a little grit, I think if you pick up the book and study that, you'll find some answers and maybe make a difference in your own life. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.